Shakespeare. What can he teach us about the nature of power? To discuss, I have on today Elliot Cohen, Seiss Professor, military historian, counselor to Secretary of State Rice, and he also has it in him to write a very thoughtful book entitled Hollow Crown: Shakespeare, How Leaders Rise, Rule, and Fall. My favorite genre of books are the ones where the authors have clearly been meditating on the themes for decades. And I think that is sort of apparent by page 3 of this book. Eliot brings not only deep readings of the plays, but also is able to range across US and world history to help illustrate the themes that he pulls out of the texts. I'm usually skeptical when books try to pitch timeless truths about the nature of politics. But this one actually really, thinking back about all the history I've read, has started to give me a different sense of how to understand and engage with and think about political leaders. So thank you, Elliot, for this.
Well,
co-hosting and helping bring the soliloquies alive today is my little brother, Phil Schneider. He recently graduated from Yale, where he starred in a production of Hamlet. He's also played, oh my God, Romeo, Octavius Valentine, Richard II, Leontes, but most importantly, he made his stage debut at 7 as Macduff's kid, where he was viciously murdered by none other than Jordan, reckless what I do despite the world, Schneider. Welcome to the stage, Phil. He's looking for a new agent. Reach out, Jordan at chinatalk.media. Let's kick it off with a passage. Elliot, why don't you give us some context on the Hollow Crown speech?
So let's begin. First, it's great to be with you. It's great to have an actor there as well. Why don't we begin with the Hollow Crown speech, in fact, because that's, after all, what the book is about. So the Hollow Crown speech is given by Richard II, who's one of the more feeble kings in Shakespeare, although he is brilliantly fluent. He's very smart, but he ends up deposed and comes to a sticky end. And what's happened is he's been deposed and he's suddenly this is a guy who'd been obsessed with being king. And he delivers this soliloquy. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king.
No, that's not your job, Elliot.
Oh, is that if Phil's going to do that?
That's my job.
Ow! All right.
For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene, to monarchize, be feared, and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh, which walls about our life, were brass impregnable, and humoured thus, comes at the last, and with a little pin bores through his castle wall. And farewell, king.
Wow.
Cover your heads, and mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away respect, tradition, form, and ceremonious duty, for you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me I am a king?
That is wonderful. I have to tell you, I've been doing a whole bunch of podcasts about this book, and it usually falls upon me, and I am not a tenth as good as Phil. So bravo. Let me just say a few things about that speech. I think one of the more poignant things about it is where he says, I need friends. And one of the things that's so striking about him as a character, and it is striking about Shakespeare's kings in general, but I would argue it is quite characteristic of most of the people at the top of, you name it, a university, a country. It's very hard for them to have friends. And some of them lose the capacity for friendship. And one of the great themes I argue in this book is that Shakespeare shows how the exercise of power over a long period of time can really strip away your humanity. So one of the things I talk about in the book is, in terms of Shakespeare's technique, is he often uses what the Greeks called anagnorisis. That's when somebody says, oh, that's what's happening, or, oh, that's who I really am. And there's a great moment in Henry VIII where that happens. Here we have the play is called Henry VIII. People weren't entirely sure that it was entirely a Shakespeare play. It may not be, but this soliloquy is Shakespeare. The person who's speaking is Cardinal Wolsey. So he has been, in effect, Henry VIII's prime minister. He's from very humble origins. He's the son of a butcher. He rises up in the church to become a cardinal. He becomes extremely powerful, and then he is suddenly deposed. And this is what he says.
Farewell, a long farewell to all my greatness. This is the state of man. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hope. Tomorrow blossoms and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. The third day comes a frost, a killing frost, and, when he thinks, good easy man, full surely his greatness is a-ripening, nips his root, and then he falls as I do. I have ventured, like little wanton boys that swim on bladders, this many summers in a sea of glory, but far beyond my depth. My high-blown pride at length broke under me, and now hast left me weary and old with service, to the mercy of a rude stream that must forever hide me.
So what's happened there is that Wolsey undergoes anagnorisis. This is who I am. I've been swimming on a sea of glory, but I'm far beyond my depth. And pop, the inflated bladder that he's been clinging to goes, and down he goes. And I remember when I heard that speech, I said, "Oh my goodness, that I know that guy." And if you live in Washington, you do know that guy. So it's a device that Shakespeare uses, this moment where somebody's facing the truth. But what's fascinating to me is there are occasions when life mirrors art rather than the other way around. And you can say that Richard Nixon's farewell to his staff was a moment of anagnorisis, where he suddenly realized who he was, what he had done. And basically the tape that you'll be hearing is a speech to his staff as he's just before he leaves the White House after having resigned the presidency. And he's, on the one hand, he's talking to them, but in another way, like Wolsey, he's also talking to himself.
We think that when we lose an election, we think that when we suffer a defeat, that all is ended. We think, as T.R. said, that the light had left his life forever. Not true. It's only a beginning, always. The young must know it. The old must know it. It must always sustain us, because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain. And so I say to you on this occasion, we leave proud of the people who have stood by us and worked for us and served this country. We want you to be proud of what you've done. We want you to continue to serve in government if that is your wish. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
Yeah. I'd encourage folks on the podcast actually to check out the YouTube, because watching Nixon's face as he like tries to grapple with what's happening is like, you're totally right, Elliot. Like, you see him opening and then kind of closing, and then the final image that you're left with is he's walking off the stage with like a thumbs up in his head as if it was a campaign rally. And so it's really like this very, very small moment where he's like, oh my God, everyone in here whose life I just like have kind of completely ruined, not only to mention my own. These are the people who are supposed to be my friends, who I've, brought up and taken to the heights of power. And like, I screwed it up for everyone.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful, theatrical moment in American history. So I recently did an episode with Matt Pottinger, who left the Trump administration on January 6th as a deputy national security advisor. I'm going to play a clip from that episode. Usually when NSC staffers end up in books, it's like not in a particularly positive light. But you've had so many nice things written about you, Matt. Is there like a secret you can tell everyone?
No, I've had my share of pretty nasty stuff written as well. So I haven't weighed the negative to the positive, but I don't know. Look, I believe that it's good for people to want to serve in those jobs. I'm very proud of my service on the NSC staff. I'm proud of what we got done. I am proud of my colleagues that I worked with, and I worked very hard to try to maintain a good working relationship with a pretty broad range of people.
So, Nixon, his big swing, big takeaway at the end of that speech, right, is you should all be proud of the work that you did. And it was so funny watching that sort of like bubble out of Matt Pottinger's subconscious, as someone who clearly left after January 6th, testified to the committee, has some mixed emotions. It must be very difficult for these people sort of reflecting at their height of power and greatness. And clearly there's, things that they regret. But that's not a face you really want to, externalize or really have to live with for the rest of your life.
Well, it's something you wrestle with when you're high up in government. So I was the counselor of the Department of State in the last 2 years of the Bush administration. So I was one of the most senior officials in the State Department, deeply involved chiefly in Iraq and Afghanistan, wars, both of which I had supported. And you do have, even when you're not working for somebody who's monstrous like Trump, or somebody who's deeply problematic like Nixon, you wrestle with your conscience all the time, and because the things you're doing have real consequences, and you see things that you may deeply disapprove of, and yet you do it, and you try to figure out, okay, where do I draw the line? The advice which I've always given to people going in, and which I followed myself, is you should always have your letter of resignation signed but undated, and you keep it in your desk drawer. But people wrestle with those things. And I think, this is maybe a little bit far from Shakespeare. I think that's the way you get through it with your character intact, is if you can take pride in the actual work you are doing, then you can get through it. If your sense of value is because I was close to the president or the Secretary of State, then you've got a problem. And I do think Shakespeare shows you how people who define the worth of what they're doing in terms of their closeness to the most powerful person or their own status, those are the ones who get themselves into moral trouble. And I know Matt Pottinger and would count him a friend, and I know how he had to wrestle with what he did, and I give him credit for coming up with it, and it was hard. And it's any powerful position, I truly believe, and I was, the one thing you didn't mention in your introduction, Jordan, was that I was a dean, which is, the way Hopkins works, a reasonably powerful position. Anytime you're in a reasonably powerful position, you're exercising power over other people, you are in constant moral jeopardy. And you need to understand that. And in a way, you need to be on guard about it. And not everybody is.
So, Elliot, let's talk about this idea of a court and how it is so kind of enticing.
When you think about the kind of politics that Shakespeare is interested in, the kind of power that he's interested in, a large part of it, not all of it, because this doesn't quite apply to his plays about ancient Rome, for example. It is about the politics of the court. And, who's the crown prince, who are the courtiers, who's the consort, who's the usurper. And people might say, well, okay, fine, that's in the era of Elizabethan kings and queens, or Tudor kings and queens. But the important thing for everybody to understand, and I think anybody who's been in a serious hierarchical organization understands that at the top, it is a court. And it's a court if you're the president. It was a court. In the State Department, I was a member of Condi Rice's court. As a dean, I was a member of the court of the president of the university, Ron Daniels. And you see court-like dynamics everywhere. And it's one of the things that's so brilliant about Shakespeare is he gets you thinking about how does that work? And what are the different characters in it? I think if you're thinking about staff, the way to get into it is actually through a set of plays which are not that often performed and not that often read, and that's the Henry VI plays. So Henry VI is the son of Henry V, who's the heroic king who gives the famous St. Crispin's Day speech. He becomes king really as an infant. And then there are 3 plays where England is basically torn apart by civil war. And a large part of those plays are about court politics. And they really, it begins at the very beginning of the Henry VI play where, his corpse is lying out there and his immediate subordinates all of a sudden begin fighting over what's going to happen next. And you see the kingdom be about to fall apart. Phil, do you have access to Henry VI?
Each hath his place and function to attend. I am left out. For me nothing remains. But long I will not be Jack out of office. The king from Eltham I intend to steal, and sit at chiefstis stern of public weal.
So here's a conniving courtier. I think if I opened a bar in Washington, I would call it Jack out of office in honor of the Bishop of Winchester. But right there, you see what's happened to a court that is, must have become corrupted under Henry V. That everybody else is, they're getting this terrible news that all these lands that Henry V had conquered in France have fallen to the French. They're all running around. They all want to get glory and go out there and win and try to win it back. And this guy is plotting and conniving. And Shakespeare spends a lot of his time with the different courtiers who surround a powerful person. And there's a lot of this kind of behavior.
So, so we've done a little bit on the court. Let's do some politics of the street. There's, probably the most famous speech, which we're going to get a version of out of Phil, of Mark Antony after Caesar's death, riling up the masses to punish Brutus for his dastardly deeds.
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones, so let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you that Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously hath Caesar answered it. Here, Under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man, so are they all honorable men, come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? When that the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. You all did see that on the Lupercal I thrice presented him a kingly crown, which he did thrice refuse. Was this ambition? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and sure he is an honorable man. I speak not to disprove what Brutus spoke, but here I am to speak what I do know. You all did love him once, not without cause. What cause withholds you then to mourn for him? O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Bear with me. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me.
You know, what's so wonderful about that speech, and it really came through in your rendition of it, Phil, is, well, a number of things. One is Antony is brilliant at riling up the crowd. You know, this continuing repeats, you know, Brutus is an honorable man. And that's actually the thing that had initially allowed the conspirators to murder Caesar and the crowd to initially think, okay, maybe this was the right thing to do because Brutus is such an honorable guy. But of course, what he does is he subtly undermines that. He gets kind of emotional and choked up. Whereas if you read Brutus's speech when they came in, and he just botches it completely. You know, he only talks about it himself and what an honorable fellow he is, and then he leaves and lets Mark Antony do that. Whereas Antony, you know, there's this show of emotion. He uses the body as a prop later on, where he says, here, I can show you all the different wounds. This was made by this guy, this guy, this guy. And then, of course, famously, the unkindest cut of all from Brutus. And he is clearly trying to whip them up. And it is in some ways feels like a cynical manipulation. Phil, just give us the very last line when they go off and they are rioting and war has broken out in Rome.
Now let it work. Mischief thou art afoot. Take thou what course thou wilt.
Right. So he knows what he is doing. Now, the thing that's interesting about this also, though, is that Shakespeare also makes it clear that Antony's grief for Caesar, who had been his mentor and benefactor and patron, is sincere. And I think this is a very important point, that one of the big things that Shakespeare can teach us is empathy, including with people we really don't like or we mistrust. And empathy means being able to understand that the person on the other side is a complicated human being. And they can have different things going on simultaneously. So in one way, if you look at that speech, you say, this is contrived, this is calculated, this is, all he's trying to do is whip up an angry mob and start a civil war. But then, if you look at the context of the things that just gone before, he's also sincere. And I would submit that when the rest of us look at very powerful people, particularly those who have control over our livelihoods or, just in some way how we live our lives or do our work, our tendency is to oversimplify them. And I think being, really marinated in Shakespeare will cause you to say, there's probably somebody complicated here.
So, speaking of riling up the crowd, perhaps the most famous riling up the crowd speech in U.S. history of the past 50 years was Donald Trump on January 6th. I'll pull sort of one or two quotes from that. So, in rewatching this, there, a few fascinating things. First, Phil had like 90 seconds. Trump had 75 minutes, right? So there's a sort of different sort of push and pull and wave and doing the selfish stuff. And you kind of talking about empathy, like, you just get the entire id like right there and you see all of it. But the kind of the bits where he is almost masterful in seeding the crowd and riling them up and sort of like raising the energy level, that you're going to see that afternoon is a really remarkable thing. Elliot, any thoughts, reflections on that?
So, on the one hand, I push back at people who make what I think are facile comparisons between Trump and, I don't know, Richard III or Macbeth or Julius Caesar. I mean, the Shakespearean characters, frankly, are a lot more interesting and have more admirable sides to them. For one thing, the three people I mentioned are all formidable soldiers, and Donald Trump had a bone spur, supposedly, which got him out of Vietnam, and he doesn't actually particularly respect military people, but he is masterful in a way in, as you say, knowing how to rile up his people. He is calculated about it. One of the things that he's very calculated about doing, and this has been true throughout his career, is just staying this side of the law. And so you will not hear him say, I want you guys to storm Congress, and if you possibly can, lynch Nancy Pelosi. He's not going to say that. He's going to do everything but. And that's what makes demagogues so dangerous. That is what demagogues do. It's not so much that they say, I want you all to go out and riot tonight and, I don't know, massacre Jews or, overthrow the government. They do everything but and keep themselves at a distance. That said, let no one doubt, Shakespeare's command of the English language was infinitely superior to Donald Trump's. And in the play, at least, so is Mark Antony's.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, though, kind of thinking about like command of the English language, where, you've in this book highlight some of the like, I've got my, world's greatest speeches text here. And, but, it and sort of a lot of those, at least in the sort of like Anglo world, are riffs off a lot of these speeches. And you're sort of pulling structures or schema or what have you. But, there is a tension of the kind of balance between high and low, where on the one hand, like, yes, it's really, there's something that's very stirring where you're like pulling from like the texts of the English language, and you're taking stuff from like St. James Bible or Shakespeare or what have you. But there's also, I mean, you can do it in Trump's way and still have a ton of effect.
Relating to diction, the Friends, Romans, Countrymen speech, it's actually, the vocabulary is pretty simple. I think what's striking about it is the Ciceronian syntax and rhetoric that he's borrowing from, right? It's all, you have all of these tricolons that are really rousing. You have the repetition of the honorable man, and the more times that this adjective is used, actually, the more times, it's fomenting sort of a questioning air about the integrity of this leader. And I think Trump, talking about towing the line, he engages a lot of times in a praeteritio or a walking about, saying, well, I'm not going to say something. I'm not going to say this about this person because that would be terrible. But in his walking around, he actually does say it. So I think we're curious about how these same rhetorical strategies from the Romans and the Greeks can be used, but, with more of an earthen vernacular, vocabulary.
I think that's a great point, Phil. But part of what Shakespeare does, which people kind of forget to do today, is to use the music of the English language, to use meter, and I mean there are all kinds of devices that you can use to make words effective. One of the things that's a pity now about Shakespeare is people have the idea, well, the vocabulary is too complicated for me to understand. I wrap my head around. That's not true at all. It's actually, a lot of it is very, very. It's very straightforward, and some of the most effective speakers know how to do that. I would also say some of the most effective speakers in Shakespeare, as in real life, are the ones who know how to speak differently to different people. And nobody does a better job of that than the Shakespearean king, who most people absolutely adore. I think he's a complete skunk, Henry V, who he can talk one way when he's trying to seduce a French princess, when he's, I'm just a simple soldier. He knows how to talk to the common soldiers. I think that's partly because he spent his youth hanging around brothels. He knows how to talk to the nobles. This is actually something that at the very beginning of that play, some of the high clergy who were trying to get him to go off to war so he won't steal their lands, say, this guy is sort of something of a chameleon. He can speak differently to different people, and it's a very high political gift. One other thing, Churchill, of course, Winston Churchill was a great lover of Shakespeare, had committed large swaths of it to memory. He was apparently held to perform Hamlet in front of him because he would be reciting the speech along with you. Richard Burton describes doing this and just how unnerving it was. He tried to speed up and slow down. He couldn't shake Churchill off. But if you look at some of Churchill's most famous speeches, that's exactly what he does.
Let me pause on Churchill. We'll get back to him later, I promise. So, on the sort of different registers thing, if you think about the 21st century and like the greatest American speech makers that we have, Obama, of course, comes to mind. And I think, as you had this list of like, what has been magic lately, and you got the Churchill 1940 stuff, you got Kennedy's inaugural, but you left out, which at least for my generation was truly incredible, was all the Obama stuff. And I think you allude to it in the end.
Okay. So here's my question to you.
Okay.
Give me one or two famous lines from Obama's speeches.
That's not the way to do it. I mean,
no, sorry, disagree. That is the way to do it. I mean, with Ronald Reagan, it's the boys of Pointe du Hoc. It's part of the success of, for Henry V, it's we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Somebody who speaks really successfully, there will be lines that will echo in your head. I mean, that's why Kennedy's inaugural is so powerful. We all know, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That's a very, very simple rhetorical form, by the way, chiasmus, where you kind of turn it backwards. And Kennedy, among others, was brilliant at it. I think Obama was. I very deliberately did not talk about Obama as a particularly effective rhetorician because I don't think he was. I think he was fluent. He could be eloquent, but there is no Obama speech. There's some speeches which he gave, which I think were good speeches for the time, but it's not like Martin Luther King. I have a dream.
Yeah, I mean, okay, whatever. I don't know where you want to set the bar, but like maybe the thing that okay, and Reagan's gonna cross it for you. All right.
Yes.
Well, we don't need to do this right now.
Reagan was a consequential president in a way that Obama was not.
But I don't want to get into this.
It's okay. You're a podcast.
So I'm just going to use the podcaster's prerogative to insert something after the fact, because I've been thinking actually a lot about this back and forth after we recorded it. First off, I think that Obama, by dint of being America's first black president, that alone makes him a consequential president, and I would argue much more likely to be remembered in 100 years from now than, say, a Kennedy or even a Reagan. I think in general, people have a hard time appreciating the magic of politicians that they're not particularly sympathetic to. That goes both for Trump and Obama in recent years. And I would put forth that, even though this wasn't like an Obama written line, the sort of theater and moment of Obama singing Amazing Grace, I think, is something that is going to ring and echo for a long time to come. Let's do perhaps the banger of all bangers. Phil, how about a St. Crispin's Day?
Would love to. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, "Tomorrow is Saint Crispian." Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars, and say, "These wounds I had on Crispin's day." Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition, and gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day.
So, yeah, what a brilliant speech. And it's so brilliant in so many ways. He's going to make these guys brothers. He calls himself Harry the King. You're going to be able to go say, "I fought with Harry the King." He's going to kind of encourage you to brag. He's going to tell you that you're a real man, and for the rest of your life, you're going to be surrounded by all these gentlemen in England who go around holding their manhoods cheap because they weren't here. Now, what's really going on? He's launched an unjust war. They're outnumbered. Usually when it's done in the movies, it's raining, it's miserable, and it's tremendously inspirational, and it's also at a profound level false, because if you look at the scenes just before, when he's the first scene of Act 4, he makes it clear what he thinks of these guys, and there's a long soliloquy. Actually, Phil, let me ask you to read it. So this is Act 4, Scene 1. I should explain. This is Henry's been walking around the camp at night, incognito, and he's hearing that his soldiers are not quite sure that this is just war, and they know that they're the ones who are going to be suffering and dying, and they're not, whereas the king, the nobles will get ransomed, and, they finally say, well, if it's an unjust war, it's the king's fault, not our fault. And that's his load to bear. And Henry then launches a soliloquy. He's speaking to the audience, revealing his innermost thoughts, which go as follows.
Upon the king, let us our lives, our souls, our debts, our careful wives, our children, and our sins lay on the king. We must bear all. O hard condition, twin-born with greatness, subject to the breath of every fool, whose sense no more can feel but his own wringing. What infinite heart's ease must kings neglect that private men enjoy? And what have kings that privates have not too, save ceremony, save general ceremony?
So this is what he really thinks. Remember, in a soliloquy, you reveal what you really think. These guys are fools. He's the king. It's really unfair that they blame him for the completely unjust war that he just started, right? And he says, what's the difference between being a king and being anybody else? Well, ceremony. So, but on the next day, he's going to tell Gloucester, I want glory. That's what I really want. Ceremony is just, the kind of the forms, the corner office. Actually, what he's out for is glory. That's what he really is out for. So my view is Henry's a complete hypocrite, but he is a brilliant manipulator of human beings, which is what some leaders are.
What's the one where he's like
about how in that speech, Henry V's education in Eastcheap his curious upbringing in London's pubs and brothels manifests rhetorically here, and how his sort of experiences in London's seedy underground actually enables him to motivate his soldiers in a way that maybe other leaders in Shakespeare fail to.
Let's start with the fact that he says, you'll be talking about King, there I was with King Harry, which is an informal form of address. His father, Henry IV, who was a very formidable king, nobody would have dared call him Harry, and he would never refer to himself in their eyes as Harry. This speaks to a certain kind of intimacy in the relationship that he has with his soldiers. He understands their desire to brag. So he says, hey, you guys, you're going to roll up your sleeve and you're going to show the scar. That does two things. That says, yeah, actually, you may get wounded in this battle. But the other thing is you're going to be able to brag and boast. There's a very interesting contrast with a play that we may be able to talk about later, Coriolanus, where the Roman general is just about to get to the very top of the Roman hierarchy, and then he blows it because the mob wants to see his wounds. They want to see his scars. And he thinks that's vile, that's disgusting, that's shameful. Henry V would probably not show his own wounds, but he understands that these guys do want to be able to show their wounds. And that's very important in motivating them. And then I think the other thing that is, it's invidious, but he does it deliberately. It's not just how good they're going to feel, it's how crummy everybody else is going to feel for not having been there.
Yeah,
and
there's a hierarchy of honor.
And he's appealing to some of their lower motives there. And I think all of that is because he spends, the first part of Henry IV, Part 1, and a good part of Henry IV, Part 2. He's hanging around, as you say, in the pubs and the brothels. He's being educated by Falstaff, who's this, wonderful comic figure, but who's very much a lowlife. But what's brilliant and shocking about it, you see it even in the beginning of Henry V, for him now to become king, he has to drop Falstaff, which breaks Falstaff's heart and really kills him. And when, shortly before, when Falstaff had asked him for a job, he looks at him and says, "I know thee not, old man," which I think, to get back to the overall theme of the book and what we can take away from it, I think it shows you that often to be a really effective leader, you can't be a nice guy. And you can't necessarily be a straightforward guy. And you cannot frequently show your real feelings and emotions, and you end up manipulating people. And I think Shakespeare's right in that, and I think he's also right in at least implying that, alas, that is necessary.
So, Elliot, the fascinating thing to me about this is if you're a leader and you're running a country, you're a king or something, you have to think you are better than everyone else in some way. But at the same time, you can't, think that all the time. You can't make other people feel that. There's this weird tension there between internalizing your superiority and desire, and deserving of all of this power. But at the same time, if that's the only way you manifest into the world, then someone's going to coup you because you're, obnoxious.
So my personal view of this is people wrestle with that often. The problem is that once they've been in power for a while, they can't throw it off. And they forget, the parts where they understand, I'm like you, as Richard II said, I need to have friends, I need to eat and drink. And that's why towards the end of the book, I talk about people who've walked away from power. And there's one, King Lear, who does a terrible job of it. He's going to divide his kingdom, but he still wants to be treated like he's king. And he becomes furious when his daughters no longer really treat him as a king once he's abdicated. But then I think the most interesting one for me is Prospero. So this is the magician in Tempest. He had been a duke. He's deposed by his brother. He's marooned on this desert island. He has all kinds of magical powers because he had studied all this stuff. And at the end of the book, where he's done everything he wanted to do, he's got his evil brother at his mercy. He's got the king at his mercy, and they've kind of reestablished their relationship. He's marrying his daughter off to the king's son.
This is a beautiful, beautiful speech. I was lucky enough to assistant direct an off-Broadway production of this a couple of years ago, and we had a wonderful older actor who just embodied the magnitude of this character. And some people have likened this speech, it's one of the, perhaps like the penultimate or third to last play that Shakespeare ever writes. People have drawn comparisons to Prospero putting down his book to Shakespeare putting down his pen. Okay, and I'll just start. He's conjuring all of the spirits on this island that have essentially, been his little fairy slaves that have enabled him to do his magic over the last couple decades. Ye elves of hills, brooks, standing lakes and groves, and ye that on the sands with printless foot do chase the ebbing Neptune, and do fly him when he comes back. You demi-puppets that by moonshine do the green sour ringlets make whereof the ewe not bites, and you, whose pastime is to make midnight mushrooms that rejoice to hear the solemn curfew, by whose aid, weak masters though ye be, I have bedimmed the noontide's sun, called forth the mutinous winds, and twixt the green sea and the azured vault set roaring war. To the dread rattling thunder have I given fire, and rifted Jove's stout oak with his own bolt. The strong-based promontory have I made shake, and by the spurs plucked up the pine and cedar. Graves at my command have waked their sleepers, oped, and let 'em forth by my so potent art. But this rough magic I here abjure, and when I have required some heavenly music, which even I do now, to work mine end upon their senses that this airy charm is for, I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummets sound, I'll drown my book.
Beautifully done. So here's the thing about this. Prospero is going to go back to be Duke again. He's accomplished everything he's wanted. He has these spectacular magic powers, which he's just cataloged and Phil just presented to us. So the question has to be asked, okay, after you've done all these things, why do you want to break your magic wand and, take your book of magic spells and throw it, some deep trench in the ocean? Wouldn't you want to hang on to all that? And I think there is an answer to that. And I think the answer is that Prospero, there's kind of a longer argument here, Prospero has come to recognize that the exercise of this rough magic, the original working title of the book was Rough Magic, that power is a kind of rough magic, that was dehumanizing him in some way. I mean, it's very striking at the very beginning of the play when he's going to explain to his daughter, how do we get here? He's kept her very sheltered. He has to take off his magic robe, and she has to help him take it off. He can't speak to his daughter the way a father should speak to a daughter while wearing his magic robe, his robes of power. And it's not that he's cheerful about any of this. He says, I'm going to go back, and my every third thought will be of the grave. I'm an old man. I've begun thinking about death. But he is a much more attractive human being when he has relinquished power. And it's part of what makes him a compelling figure. In the book, I talk about, leaders who've been unsuccessful at leaving power, but then those who have. And of course, the great one from American history is George Washington, who does it twice. First, when he's the commander of the Continental Army after independence has been won, he makes a very big production. By the way, he loved Shakespeare. He loved theater, of returning his commission to the Continental Congress where he stood and they sat. So it was making very clear who's in charge. And he hands over the paper commission. And then, of course, he steps down as president. And, the most impressed spectator to all this from a distance was King George III, who twice said, if he does that, he'll be the most remarkable man of the age. But I think Washington understood it. And like Prospero, it was not, neither retirement was particularly happy for a whole bunch of reasons, including his health, but going well beyond that. But it is part of what made him a truly great man as well as a great leader.
Okay. So, we've had the sort of beautiful exits. We also have some not particularly beautiful exits, two of whom are currently running for president in their late 70s and 80s. I didn't know this. It's exceedingly rare for people to know when to hang up their hat. Elliot, where should we? Let's start with Shakespeare, and then we'll talk about Biden and Trump.
I think probably the best example of this is towards the end of Henry IV, Part 2, where the father of Henry V, the hero of Agincourt, the guy who gives the St. Crispin's Day speech, he's dying. Prince Hal, as he then is, comes in to, pay his respects. And he sees the crown. He thinks his dad is croaked, and he puts the crown on his own head. And his father wakes up, and there's a furious scene. They sort of reconcile at the end. But the thing that's so striking about Henry IV's exit, and particularly these rather harsh words that he addresses to Prince Hal, it's clear that he doesn't think anybody else can do the job that he's done. And if you think about it, that's Trump's "I alone can do it." But I think it's also, alas, where President Biden is. I'm the only guy who can really, defeat Trump and kind of run the country properly, which is nonsense. But I think, understandable, and somebody who's been in the Senate for, I don't know how long, half a century, something like that. And it is a good example of what power, how power messes with your sense of reality.
Okay, so Prince goes, "I never thought to hear you speak again." And his father replies, "Thy wish was father, Harry, to that thought. I stay too long by thee. I weary thee. Thou dost so hunger for mine empty chair that thou wilt needs invest thee with my honors before thy hour be ripe. O foolish youth, thou seek'st the greatness that will overwhelm thee. Stay but a little, for my cloud of dignity is held from falling with so weak a wind that it will quickly drop. My day is dim. Thou hast stolen that which, after some few hours, were thine without offence, and at my death thou hast sealed up my expectation. Thy life did manifest thou lovest me not, and thou wilt have me die assured of it. Thou hitst 1,000 daggers in thy thoughts, whom thou hast whetted on thy stony heart to stab at half an hour of my life."
So, what's so striking about that is that line, "O foolish youth, thou seekst the greatness that will overwhelm thee." You're not up to it, kid. That's what he's really saying. And it's partly because Hal is a very different guy. In some ways, he's a very different guy than Henry IV. In some ways, he's actually very similar. I mean, they're both manipulative, duplicitous, cunning, ruthless characters. But it's Henry IV can't let go. And he can't believe that his successor will be able to do the job. That's, by the way, extremely common in the world of business and just about everything else, where people are just convinced, you know what, so-and-so is going to be the next CEO, but I bet you they can't handle it.
I loved the Churchill quote you had, where he's like 80 years old. Anthony Eden, the guy's like anointed successor, who he's been training, for 15 years. He's like, 80 years old. I don't think he's got it. he doesn't have the juice. Mao ran through 7 people. Ray Dalio ran through 7 people. There's something where, having particularly the ones that have like won a lot, to then be, you were talking about this earlier, Elliot, like, it's like to get to this point, so many things have gone so right for you. And then you live a life for 5-10 years where everyone around you is telling you how brilliant you are, and you have a whole institution whose job it is to make you seem, infallible, and then to go to be like, oh, I'm actually replaceable, and someone else can step in, and basically things won't fall off the rails is a tricky psychological thing to get around when you're at the end of your life.
And there's one other part to it, which is that, you've also suffered, because powerful people suffer on the way up. Their, the sense of responsibility, their fears, the mistakes that they know they made that other people don't know that they made. So you're carrying, I think any leader is carrying a lot of scars around with them. And that goes into that feeling is that, you don't know what I went through, and I doubt that you could, get through it the way I did. And that's another, I agree with everything you said, but I think that's another element.
Yeah, I was just going to paraphrase the author's words that there's an inability to accurately assess his own succession that arises from a failure to fully understand himself, that we see evident in that.
Yeah.
Well, because, the father is unable to really... I wonder what St. Crispin's Day speech looks like in the mouths of this person, from the mouths of this leader. He's wary of someone that perhaps possesses a strength that he himself does.
Oh, I think that's right. And succession often goes badly. I think I talk in the book about, but most of the examples I give are historical or current political ones, but I do have some business examples, and I talk about Jack Welch, the famous head of GE, who really built it, and developed, among other things, a very elaborate program for selecting people and grooming people for higher positions. And his personally selected, carefully vetted successor was Jeffrey Immelt, who presided over the breakup of GE and its, effectively its collapse. And I contrast it a little bit with Steve Jobs, who at Apple, who actually picked a successor very successfully, who was very different than he was, from the buttoned-down rather culture of IBM, who had a different skill set. And the reason why I suggest is because Steve Jobs had suffered a lot. He had been fired twice from big jobs in big humiliating ways, and he was a cancer survivor, although he eventually died of it. And those had induced a kind of humility of a sort in him, which I think is very rare in high-level leaders. And I suspect that the suffering that gave him that humility is actually what also allowed him to pick a successor who grew Apple far more than he did.
The idea thinking about like, okay, we're going to like run all these quantitative tests to like find our next person. But at the end of the day, if the top person in charge is the one choosing the next one, there's going to be so much human attachment. Who reminds me of my son or daughter, that kind of is going to end up bleeding into it. And that's really where you get thrown off. And it's not this, it's not this kind of like, idealized version of like a Chinese meritocracy where like first you run your city well, then you run your state well, and you get promoted or not. It's like, it comes down to these personal relationships. And just because you can win over your boss and play the court politics well, doesn't necessarily mean that if you're in the seat, you're going to be able to drive in the way that the country needs you.
Or it may simply be that the tasks which your successor are going to have are very different than the tasks that you had. And, again, I think one of the things you can learn from Shakespeare and from elsewhere too is leaders are not fungible. It's not a kind of a universal competence where the same person is good for every situation. I'm a military historian, essentially. There's some generals who are great at fighting defensive wars. There's some who are great at fighting offensive wars. There's some who are great at conventional war. There's some who are great at irregular war. You shouldn't assume that they're all equally good at each of them.
Let me speed run through some other observations I had over your book.
Yep.
Henry V, when he says, "Oh, Kate, nice." So Kate, the French queen, goes like, "Oh, I don't want to kiss you. Like, I don't kiss people." Henry goes, "Oh, Kate, nice customs, curtsy to great things," which, immediately Trump 2005. I just kiss women. They let you do it. You can do anything when you're a star. The sort of violence arc that you portray in Macbeth of like, you do one murder, kind of works, you do your second, you do your third, all of a sudden it's a pattern. I love the little parallel you drew there from mass murderers to Arthane of Cawdor. But maybe, let's close on, where haven't we gone yet? I don't know. Phil, you got anything? Elliot, maybe Zelensky we can finish on? What do you think?
Well, I love Coriolanus.
Okay.
And
Kind of a dark
there,
one, but all right, we can end there.
I do dark. And I think Phil, if you could do, it's the speech where Coriolanus loses it. And here's the Coriolanus, the story of this great Roman general. He wants to be consul. He's been very successful. He almost gets there, and then the crowd says, "We want to see your scars," and he loses it. Actually, Phil, that's the passage I'd like you to do. Actually, there'll be another passage of a different kind that I'll ask you to do later on, and it's a wonderful moment where he is furious at being asked to show his wounds.
Better it is to die, better to starve, than crave the hire which first we do deserve.
He wants to be sort of like just appointed to this job. He doesn't want to have to campaign for it. And then what really drives him around the bend is they ask him to show their wounds. I taught this once in a class. My students were all graduate students, pretty much. There were a few undergraduates. And it included about half a dozen veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. And I said, you don't have to answer the question, but let me ask you, has anybody ever asked to see your wounds? And that part of the conversation went on for an hour because they all had. And there was the same reaction that Coriolanus had, is, how dare you? How dare you? I did this out of honor. I did this out of service. And you want to kind of look into my soul and you want to feel sorry for me? This is something you can't really understand what it is that I went through. And it's one of the ways in which it really hit me that Shakespeare speaks to us, and he speaks to some essentials of the human condition. And in some ways, those haven't changed. Now, where this ends up is a pretty dark place. So maybe you could read that speech, Phil, You Common Cry of Curs.
You common cry of curs, whose breath I hate, as reek the rotten fens, whose loves I prize, as the dead carcasses of unburied men that do corrupt my air. I banish you, and here remain with your uncertainty. Let every feeble rumor shake your heart. Your enemies, with nodding of their plumes, fan you into despair. Have the power still to banish your defenders, till at length your ignorance, which finds not till it feels, making but reservation of yourselves, still your own foes, deliver you as most abative captives to some nation that won you without blows. Despising for you the city, thus I turn my back. There is a world elsewhere.
So it's a wonderful depiction of a leader who's been rejected. And that happens too. And the fury, and it leads Coriolanus to commit treason and nearly destroy Rome. I was wondering, Jordan, if we could, to wrap things up, we've been doing a lot of high drama here, murderers, battles, stuff like that. Shakespeare is also capable of describing ways in which the more human kinds of leaders, not always the most successful ones, I might add, can have a very human side. And so maybe go back to where we began, to Julius Caesar. Phil, I'm going to ask you to read up from page 86 of the book, the dialogue between Brutus and Cassius. So Julius Caesar, you've had Brutus, who's kind of a bit of a prig, and Cassius, who's kind of a manipulator, who was the kind of mastermind behind the coup that killed Julius Caesar. They're about to fight the big battle against Mark Antony and Octavius and Lepidus, which will, as it turns out, end in their deaths. And the two of them have had a major falling out, but then they sort of understand, okay, this was something of a misunderstanding. They kind of reconnect as Cassius realizes, oh my God, Brutus's wife, to whom Brutus had been devoted, has just died. And they reestablish a human connection. And I was just wondering, Phil, if maybe you could finish us off with that.
All right, Phil, why don't I tap in?
And whether we shall meet again, I know not. Therefore our everlasting farewell take. For ever and for ever farewell, Cassius. If we do meet again, why we shall smile. If not, why then this parting was well made.
Forever and forever farewell, Brutus. If we do meet again, we'll smile indeed. If not, 'tis true this parting was well made.
I always find that one of the most moving parts of that play, in some ways the most moving. These are two flawed leaders. Neither is entirely successful. But there's true friendship in those lines. And the way Shakespeare shows you there's true friendship is by having Cassius mirror back to Brutus's own sentiments. This may be it, in which case forever and forever farewell. And maybe we'll survive, and if so, we'll have a good laugh about it. And if we don't, the parting was well made. So I think Shakespeare reminds us that, you can strive and you can try and you can lead and you may fail, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you simply have to lose your humanity if you try.
Last question for you, Elliot. You recommended a handful of other pieces of fiction that you think help elucidate some of the themes that you raise here. You want to give us three novels to take us out on?
I think Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men, which is basically about Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana, who was a demagogue. It's a fantastic political novel. Another political novel would be Edwin O'Connor's The Last Hurrah, which is about the last election campaign. It's a fictionalized account of James Curley, who was a very famous, rather corrupt Boston politician. But it's a very intimate look at politics in a ethnically divided city, and at what motivates, in particular, the mayor who wants another go, and I think a sympathetic look at them. And then there's the big one, War and Peace, which is Tolstoy, who has a darker view of leaders, particularly Napoleon. And there's so much in War and Peace, but one part of it is how much of the time Napoleon is fooling himself about his ability to control events. And it's not that Tolstoy depicts him as a monster. He doesn't depict him as a monster. He depicts him as a bit of a fool. And it's a different kind of take. I'm not sure historically accurate. I'm not so sure. But as a novel, fabulous.
So we're going to close with Orson Welles talking to Dick Cavett in 1970 about Marshall and Churchill.
Marshall is the greatest man I ever met.
Really?
Yes, I would think so.
What would you admire about him above everybody else?
Human being.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's the greatest human being who was also a great man, who I was ever privileged to meet.
Have you known some that were...
Can I tell a little story about him?
Certainly.
We'd been campaigning for Roosevelt, not George Marshall, but some of the rest of us, and one of our rewards when he got in again, one of those many times that he did, was to go to a big party of very big brass and sit on the dais and be treated as though we were part of the high command just for one night. And there were all these tremendous names from the Second World War. 2 or 3 civilians. Truman, the vice president, who was playing the piano. We were rather embarrassed about that because he didn't seem to be awfully good on the piano. And we didn't know that he was going to be a great president, you see.
I see.
And it didn't look as though he did either, as a matter of fact. But he and so there were only about 4 or 5 civilians. All the rest were tremendous brass, dripping with gold, braid, and medals, and everything else. And it was in the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. And a door opened, and GI, more innocent looking than anything you could possibly imagine and younger than anything you could dream of, stuck his head in. At the moment when General Marshall happened to look toward the door, and the boy looked at him, he said, "Gee, General Marshall, can I come in and say hello to you?" Marshall said, "Yeah, come in." And Marshall didn't know anybody was watching. This wasn't a grandstand play. I was in a position, my camera was angled, so he didn't know he was getting photographed in anybody's film of memory.
Yeah.
And he took the boy aside, away from everybody, and sat down with him. I heard as he went that the boy had been away from home, and the boy recognized Marshall as somebody like a family. Now, this was the commander of all the Allied forces. And he sat with this boy without any grandstanding at all, and just put him at ease and made him feel at home again for half an hour and left all the rest of us. He was that kind of fellow.
I wonder what the difference is between a man like that and the ones who are impressive publicly but couldn't be bothered to talk to anyone that isn't important to them or flattering.
Well, I don't know. Those kind of people are all second-rate, who can't be bothered at all, ever.
Yeah.
But there are those who can't be bothered sometimes. You know, and you had a feeling with Marshall that if it were possible to be bothered, he would let himself be bothered. Yeah. He was a tremendous gentleman, you know, an old-fashioned institution which isn't with us anymore.
You almost never want to ask anyone the question who's impressed you the most, and it's wonderful to have a guest who can give you the answer.
Well, I never do know the answers to those kind of
They're
questions,
hard,
you know, but I just happened to know that one. Yeah. Of course, I was immensely impressed with Churchill, but he was quite another thing, you know. He had great humor and great irony. He went to see me when I played Othello on the stage in London, and I heard a low murmuring in the front row. I thought he was talking to himself, and then he came backstage afterwards and sat down in the dressing room and said, "Most potent, grave, and reverend signors, my most approved good masters," and began the whole of Othello's part, which he had memorized, and including the cuts which I had made, which he read with a good deal of extra emphasis. And then a few years afterwards, I happened to be in Venice trying to get some money for a movie during the festival, and poor Churchill had been, right after the war, as you know, crest of the greatest victory that any single man had ever presided over in modern history, was voted out of office. Quite properly, probably, but it was a tragic blow for him. And there he was in the hotel at the Lido with Clemmy, his wife, alone. And he'd go swimming out on the beach. And one day at lunch, I came in with a Russian businessman I was trying to hustle for some money for this picture. And as we passed Mr. Churchill's table, Mr. Churchill saw me and made that little gesture, and the Russian went out of his mind. This is a white Russian, not a red Russian. This is a you know, a hustling, semi-Armenian Russian. And when he saw that Mr. Churchill not only knew me, but gave a rather special acknowledgement, it was clear to me that I had the money for my picture. So the next morning I was out swimming in the beach, and I found myself paddling in the water right next to Mr. Churchill. And I hadn't gone up to speak to him, but there we were in the water, and I had known him on and off during the war in a humble capacity, and I said, and he had come backstage to see me, and I said, Mr. Churchill, I think you ought to know what you did for me. And I told him about how this acknowledgement had meant so much to me with my financier. And that day at lunch, I came in with a financier again, and Mr. Churchill rose from his chair and bowed.